And today we have a very special guest with us today. And before we introduce her, I just want to introduce some of the other people that are going to be asking questions along with me. So today we have Julia Mattingly. If you would just like to say hi real quick. We also have Daniel. Daniel, are you here? Let me send you live real quick.
Hello.
Okay, there we go. And we hope that this will be the first of many events hosted by the Louisville Political Review. And we also encourage you to follow LPR on social media, as well as check out our student publications on our website. Links will be posted later in the chat. I'd also like to explain the function of our Q&A. So if at any point during the session you have a question that you would like us to ask Dr. Farrier, by all means, just type it in there and we'll look through them. And so anyways, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest, Dr. Jasmine Farrier. So just a brief introduction, Dr. Farrier, she's been a member of the Department of Political Science here at U of L since 2002. And last year, she was the former chair of the Political Science Department, but she's moved on to bigger and better things, and she's currently the VP for University Advancement. So without further ado, here is Dr. Farrier. And if you would just introduce us more about what your teaching and research areas are.
Sure. Thank you, Caleb, Julia, and Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't had you in class yet, Daniel, but I've had a wonderful experience teaching and learning with Julia and Caleb last year. It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you very much for asking me. I have been at the University of Louisville, as Caleb said, for 19 years, and all of my career has been here at the university. And I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak with students and with anybody who has political questions, as long as they know that they're not going to get a lot of political answers from me. And Caleb and Julia know this well. My method of teaching is not to necessarily tell people what to think, what to do, what to read, and how to approach their own personal identity and orientation as citizens. My goal is to make sure that we all have constitutional literacy, which does not mean worshiping the text, but certainly knowing what's in it, what's not, and why, and looking at the world through different institutional perspectives. So I study, I teach, and I research all three branches of the national government. Currently, I'm teaching an American Congress class with the Kentucky Congressman, John Yarmouth, who is of our district, meaning he is the sole House of Representatives member for the 3rd District that I think we're all sitting in right now. I've also had the pleasure of doing a lot of work for the McConnell Center over the past 19 years, and I take any opportunity to get to know a public official. As you know, political science has always been very proud of our alums on both sides of the aisle at the local, state, and federal level, and there's a wonderful opportunity to connect with alums who are in the real world of politics through the Department of Political Science and the new chair, Dr. Jason Gaines. Happy to take those questions as well later. I'm ready.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Farrier. And are you teaching a class next semester?
I am. So until further notice, I will teach just one class a semester. So I'm doing the American Congress every spring and the American Presidency every fall.
Okay, and
however, there's a catch, Caleb.
Yeah.
With my new job, I am going to be teaching at 8 a.m.
8 a.m. That's quite early.
So right now, yes, I teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 8 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. Just Tuesday and Thursday, so you only have to sacrifice twice a week. I take that as a personal challenge. I will be interesting first thing in the morning. And right now I'm doing a hybrid. So we do Thursdays live in person, maybe not tomorrow because of the weather, but we will certainly try to get back on track live. And in the fall semester, hopefully we can be live again. And I'm at my best in person, I think.
Yeah, me and Julia know that, definitely. And me and Julia also know that her class, it's a delight, but it's a challenge too. So for any students wanting a good challenge, a good push, I highly recommend taking any one of Dr. Farrier's classes.
Thank you.
So without further ado, I'm going to ask the first question of the night. So obviously, Trump's presidency, we've seen a lot of things that we haven't seen before, which makes it unprecedented, hence the title. And one of the things we haven't seen is a president being impeached twice. So he has truly made history in that regard. But since he has been acquitted, we're wondering what precedent this would set for future presidents.
Well, that's a very good question, and it's hard to tell, I'll be honest with you, because in political science, as in many social sciences, you want a large N, as in a large number in a data set. We only have 4 impeachments. Ever. No convictions. So, of course, I'm talking about Andrew Johnson, the president who succeeded Lincoln, Bill Clinton, and then Donald Trump twice. So although sometimes people think that Richard Nixon was impeached, of course he resigned to avoid not only certain impeachment, but certain conviction, which the Constitution requires, a 2/3 vote for removal. So what's interesting about this is that the historical record will stand. When I teach the presidency next fall, I will teach these impeachments. The precedent, though, is a much more complicated story because there can be partisan uses of impeachment that come back very quickly. And that might be as soon as 2022 when we see the midterm elections. If Republicans take a majority of the House of Representatives, will they set their sights on President Biden? Impeachment requires a simple majority. It is not meant to be used, however, as a simple majority party tool. Nevertheless, the temptation may be there to seek some kind of institutional revenge. We can talk about that a little bit later, but that is an unfortunate partisan question that looms over us right now.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up is that with the failure of the Senate to successfully actually indict Donald Trump, would it perhaps signal a further loss of power on the part of Congress to successfully restrain a ever-growing powerful presidency?
I would say that's an interesting question, but again, remember the Constitution has a very firm set of guidelines about how to convict and remove. So the impeachment is really the indictment. It's not a legal proceeding, of course. It's a political and institutional proceeding that has the trappings of a legal proceeding. So the House is the indicting body, the grand jury, you might say, and the articles of impeachment are the bills of indictment. Then the prosecutors or the managers are presenting the case to the jurors. The Constitution only has a handful of instances in which a supermajority is required to do something. This is one of them. So the simple majority is required for impeachment, but 2/3 is needed for Senate conviction. So I'll throw this back at you. Why does the Constitution make certain provisions a supermajority requirement? Can you think of others that require a supermajority? And then we will figure out together why the Constitution's framers, long dead, are very much present with us, not on rights, not on liberties, and not always on powers, but on structures and processes. So this is the structural question. Why 2/3? And where else do we require 2/3?
I think I know the answer. I remember.
Okay, Julia.
Let me send it to Julia real quick.
Well, I remember you talking about in class, you said they did that so, if you're going to impeach a president or override a veto, which I think is the other instance, which is 2/3, you better have a good reason.
That's correct. They can't force us to have a good reason, though. But they can force us to have a broader coalition. And the assumption is that Julia is correct, which is how do you get to 2/3? So let's just look at it in stark personal terms for the jurors who were the senators last week. There are 50 Democrats. Therefore, they would have to find 17 Republicans to get to 67, which is 2/3. The number 67 is not magical. It would not be in the Constitution. It's just 2/3 of the number of senators. at that time. So with fewer states, it would be a lower requirement. Well, today, we would say that that's a bipartisan effort. Now, 7 Republicans did cross over to convict the president, but that was 10 short. Would we say that if the Democrats got 17 Republicans, that this was truly a bipartisan movement? Or the other option would be if the Democrats or the Republicans, which can happen, but it's rare, get 67 votes naturally through elections. We haven't had supermajorities like that. Right now, the Senate is held obviously 50-50. So as Julia said, overriding a veto, it has the same requirement, except it's in both chambers. So it's actually twice as hard. When the president vetoes, the president is telling the legislative body that he knows the national interest better than they do. And the Constitution gives him an advantage because I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's very rare for Congress to override a presidential veto. Over President Trump's first term, Congress did it once. And there are really easy graphs I can show you from the Senate's website that show how rare it is to have a veto override. Would anyone else like to venture a guess as to other supermajority requirements in the Constitution? Julia's going to be off the hook now, maybe Caleb or Daniel. Although, again, I don't think I've had the pleasure of having you in class, but there are a few other instances in which the Constitution demands a supermajority.
Amendments, correct?
Yes.
To the Constitution? Yeah.
Yes. Very good, Daniel. The Constitution requires 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, or 2/3 of a special ratifying convention or petition for a ratifying convention. Put that aside. There are a lot of ways of amending the Constitution. The most common way is 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, but that's only the first part. Then what happens, Daniel? It goes
to the states.
Correct.
3/5, I believe.
Very close, 3/4.
Okay, that's right.
Yes, so 3/4 of states, through their legislative bodies or through ratifying conventions, have to agree for the amendment to be put into the constitutional text. So that is a hurdle, a series of hurdles. It's not one hurdle. Again, what are the framers saying from beyond the grave? This is actually the most interesting part to me about studying the Constitution's bones. It's not about parsing every word for what it meant to them in their time. I'm not sure it matters what interstate commerce meant to them. But what I am curious as to why they made it so hard to change the text of the Constitution and how those processes are still with us. It doesn't mean, though, that we don't ever progress with the Constitution. What it means is that amendments are hard, but we interpret the Constitution every day, and we have to be sure that we understand when constitutional dialogue and constitutional development takes place, which is all the time. That's maybe a next question. A final one that just to think about is about ratifying treaties. So the Constitution's founders were very wary and a little bit afraid of foreign entanglements. So not trade agreements, but treaties. So formal treaties must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate only. And then there are a couple of other supermajorities, but this gives you an idea of the things that they feared the most. And the things that they feared are ways that simple majorities could, in the framers' mind, do damage to the Republic without these special obstacles.
So I remember was it last semester? 2 semesters ago, when I took your class, there was this very interesting analogy you used in which it's better for, it's kind of like an electricity breaker in a house. It's better for it to cut off the electricity than for the house to catch on fire, right? So would it be that to prevent, I guess, actions that aren't well contemplated or don't have a wide coalition? It's to prevent these hasty actions from being carried forward.
That's a very good question. So where does this go wrong? Maybe we should reverse it, Caleb. I think part of the problem when we study the framers is that we assume we're supposed to like their ideas. And here, let's flip it and say we don't like this idea. The most legitimate form of government, you might say, is one in which a unanimous agreement takes place. We all agree we want the same thing, but that's really unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So mathematically, the next thing that you might argue is most legitimate after unanimity is a supermajority. Okay, that's still hard to do. Then how about a simple majority, which is 50% plus 1?
Plus 1?
Oh, yeah. So 50% plus 1 is a simple majority. Is that a legitimate number to govern? What do we think? Yes. Is it? Is that what the most people want? Why is it acceptable for us to put extra obstacles in the way of expressing majorities? So in other words, if you vote for a person, that person wins, or that party wins, or that set of ideas wins, do you have the right to act on those things? If you don't, then the people who voted for you are not necessarily being represented. What the Constitution does in more than one way, the supermajority requirement is just one of them, is it creates a series of obstacles for easy translation of simple majorities from a bill to a law. But we also add in extra obstacles ourselves. So for example, the Senate has a rule on cloture, which is closing debates, that is more commonly called a filibuster. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, but an article of the Constitution says that Congress can make its own rules for its own chambers. So the fact that the Senate has a filibuster rule is not a constitutional requirement, but it gives yet another supermajority obstacle course that we are still dealing with today. And it changes the meaning of an election. Are elections about the individual winners who take their places in the House and Senate? Every single one of them, by the way, won an election. Nationally, we decide who's in the majority or the minority based on how other districts and states have run their elections. But John Yarmouth, for example, as the person who represents the 3rd district, and Leader McConnell and Senator Paul, they can all be legitimately elected, but in the minority, depending upon what the rest of the country did. You might say then, if they're in the minority, and they've had that experience, they've all been in both, you might ask, why can't they be heard as well? Their voters put them in office legitimately. So it's more of a conundrum about translating the meaning of any one election into law.
Okay, thank you for the response, Dr. Farrier. Now, before I pass the baton to Julia to ask the next question, I want to encourage our audience to once again look at the Q&A function. If you have a question at any point, you're free to submit a question, and we'll ask those at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to let Julia ask the next question.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia. I am managing editor at the Louisville Political Review. Thank you again, Dr. Farrier, for coming. I took 2 of our classes last year. I took presidency in the fall and Congress in the spring. They're both a lot of fun, definitely very challenging, but you learn a lot, and she's an excellent professor, so I highly recommend taking one of her classes if you can.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So moving on to our next president, Joe Biden. So as of yesterday, Joe Biden has signed more than 30 executive orders. With the president's increasing use of unilateral powers, most notably executive orders, has it become easier to undermine or even erase the legacy of previous presidents?
Yes, that's a great question. So first I'd like to explain what an executive order is, then explain why they're so popular amongst all presidents in the modern era, and how they can be challenged. And then we'll talk about the significance. So I'll do that in that order. An executive order, it can be understood as a law, but it really is not. And it could have the spirit of law, but it is not. It's a very specific action. An executive order is a command from the president to a leader of his branch. It can be to his attorney general, who's the head of the Justice Department. It could be to the Secretary of Homeland Security. It could be the Secretary of Commerce. It is an order within the executive branch. The executive order has an authority that is only based in two different origins. One is the Constitution's text that in Article 2 says many times that the president is the chief executive. Think about what the word executive means. It's a structural word that means to carry out. So the Constitution does authorize the president to carry out the law. What is the law then? It's law passed by Congress. So what's interesting about an executive order is that most of the time when you look at them, and by the way, we can put this in the chat, the National Archives hold all the texts for modern executive orders. If you go before Franklin Roosevelt, you might have to go to an actual archive, but most of them are available with a click. And most executive orders have embedded in them the law that they are authorized to use. Thank you. So, for example, the Clean Air Act is a famous landmark, and it is an important environmental law that was passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by President Nixon. You can imagine that a massive environmental law would not be able to take into consideration all the future possibilities of how it can be used. So Congress does not always delegate that level of detail to the executive branch. So baked into many laws, and most notably in landmark laws, it allows future presidents to interpret and allows future environmental protection agencies, the EPA, to interpret the law to meet what they are considering their top agenda items. So the point here is that when President Obama used Nixon-era environmental laws to ban certain coal-fired power plants, he is using his executive power to interpret a law that may have been given to him in a previous statute. Now, when President Trump took office, he reversed a lot of those environmental executive orders, but they're not reversing the law itself. Those are just a couple of examples of what you're talking about. So one is, what is the exact, again, the authority of the order is generated inside the executive branch, but it's not made up by the executive branch. It has to have, again, a root in the Constitution and in the law. However, if Congress does not like the way that the president is interpreting the law, they can change it. So some controversial examples from the Trump administration included the travel ban and some of the tariff policies that the president put into place to protect certain American industries. These are not always technically executive orders. You might say that President Barack Obama had executive orders regarding what are called DACA and DAPA rules about prosecutorial discretion regarding illegal immigration. Sometimes they're called DACA and DAPA. It's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Under President Obama, it was not an executive order, but it was a memo sent by his Homeland Security Chief, Janet Napolitano. And what these things do is, in effect, say, as president, I'm allowed to interpret how I carry out the law. In some cases, I might be more restrictive, and in other cases, I might be more relaxed. I'm interpreting the law that my executive carry-out branch is allowed to do. But what if there's an opposition? There are a lot of ways of opposing an executive action. One is to ask Congress to change the law, close those loopholes, take away the discretion of the president. Two is to go the more litigious route. You can sue in federal court and say one of two things, that the president is acting in an unconstitutional manner because there's no discretion. Or two, the president is acting in an unconstitutional manner because he's misinterpreting the discretion that Congress has given him. There are famous landmark court cases that the Supreme Court has actually, in a couple of very important cases, told presidents that they're abusing executive order power. For the most part, however, courts are not really interested in getting into that type of adjudication. But if any of you have ever taken a constitutional law class, you might know the famous case that took place when President Truman issued an executive order for his Commerce Secretary to seize and run the nation's steel mills. Sound familiar to anybody?
Mm-hmm. Covered it extensively in the American presidency class you taught.
Yes. So maybe one of you can quickly Google it. I use Oye, which is a website that gives wonderful summaries of court cases. The case is called Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, 1952. This is an example where you don't take the president to court abstractly because you don't like what he's doing. You have to have an injury. And in this case, the injured party is the steel mill that is arguing President Truman has given an unconstitutional order to his Commerce Secretary, that's Sawyer, to run the nation's steel mills. Now, why on earth would the president want to nationalize steel mills? Do you remember why?
It was in the context of the Korean War, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's correct. So the president was afraid that a labor dispute that was brewing between labor organizations and management and owners would interrupt the war effort. It's a long, interesting case. Again, it's maybe more the exception than the rule, but it proves that under certain circumstances, the Supreme Court will step into a separation of powers dispute and do Congress's work for it, if it believes that there's a strong record that says that this is an abuse of the executive order. So let's defend presidents for just a moment. So that was the origin of the executive order and how you can refute it or challenge it. The most common way, though, is what you said earlier. Presidents just turn them over. You live by the executive order, the next president will live by the executive order, and their first order of business might be reversing your orders. So why is this a problem? It's only a problem if we believe that legislative bodies should take the agenda-setting idea of what it is that the American people want, whatever that means, and turn it into new law or adjust the existing books of law. When a president is doing this unilaterally, what they're saying is, my national election is more important than your elections. And I see the world differently and in a more superior way to a collection of local and state representatives. So it's an interesting theoretical question. The president is the only person elected nationally, although it's indirect through the Electoral College, along with the vice president. There's no other national election. The House and Senate are collections of local and state elections. Who sees the, quote, national interest better? It's a fascinating question. Only one party gets the White House, only one person becomes president, but the House and Senate have a much more diverse array of not only parties, but interests, regions of the country, geographic areas, and of course they have a wide variety of ideas on the issues that affect people. There's only one winner for the presidency. Why should that one voice supersede all of these others? What presidents say is that they were elected to do a job and they're going to do it. And when Congress is not helpful, get out of my way. President Obama said this famously. He said, I have a pen and I have a phone. Now, what did he mean by that? He will do his best to try to build coalitions quickly and effectively. But if that fails, he will use the pen, and the pen can be the signing of executive orders. It's very common for presidents of both parties to say that this is not just the last resort, it is their first resort when they believe they have a clock, they have to deliver, there are pressing issues facing the nation, and we don't have time for the gridlock that Congress, unfortunately or fortunately, delivers.
Okay, Julie, you're live.
Yeah.
Well, that was very thorough. Thank you.
I'm only speaking in miniature lectures today. So.
We love that.
Unless there's a lightning round.
No, take your time. Yeah, next I'm going to pass it on to Daniel. He's one of our two amazing associate editors. So, Daniel, whenever you want to start.
Cool. Well, hi there. My name is Daniel Rankin. I'm the associate editor with the Louisville Political Review. I got to tell you, Dr. Farrier, I'm sold. Julia and Caleb have been talking about you since I've known them earlier this year, and I haven't gotten the chance to take one of your classes. But
Okay.
after just a half hour, I'm like, oh, I need to take one of her classes because this is great. So
Well, thank you, Daniel. Daniel, tell me, what do you study in political science?
Science. So
I know. But what are your what areas are you most interested in?
I'm still trying to define that out a little bit, trying to look at it.
Okay.
Thinking about law school maybe, but for now I'm just kind of doing my thing right now. But yeah, I really need to take one of your classes because stuff like this is very interesting. Speaking of which, I'm actually taking Dr. Martin's class in the constitutional powers.
Good. Yeah, and she's terrific. So I've known her for a very long time, and she's a wonderful teacher with a PhD and a JD. So she can give a lot of advice about going to law school as well as other options. Yes. And please do not hesitate to reach out to ask her some career advice.
I might have to do that.
Good.
So we've been learning a lot about judicial review and how the Constitution is interpreted, not by just the Supreme Court, but how it should be interpreted by Congress and the executive branch. So I thought I wanted to dive into that, but first let's see here. The question, we've seen in the past attempts by Congress to tamp down on the powers of the executive using powers that the Constitution has delegated to it, such as passing the War Powers Resolution. However, you note in your recent book that recently Congress has formed a habit of asking the judiciary to restrain the president. You argue that because of this, Congress has essentially shirked its ability to restrain the president, ceding more power to the executive. So do you think this is an imbalance that can never be fixed, or do you think this dysfunction is here to stay?
Sorry, I'm so happy to whoever came up with that question.
I believe that was Julia.
Julia, thank you. No. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was briefly distracted. I saw that Stan Scott made some comments. Maybe I'm looking at the live event, and I just want to say hello because he is a former student who I knew at the beginning of my career here, and I know that he's teaching as well and got his undergraduate and graduate degree here at U of L. So I just want to give a quick hello to Stan. It's been a long time, and I'm so pleased that he's here. The question about litigation is really interesting. So again, miniature lecture warning. Do you have a graphic?
Graphic for?
My miniature lecture that's about to happen.
Sure. I'll try.
This is not, and unfortunately, this is not going to be a short answer because it's a subject very close to my heart.
Oh, please do. This is great.
Okay, well, thank you. So the Constitution does not really give the power of judicial review explicitly to the court. But as any astute student knows, the court asserted the power of judicial review and has nursed the legitimacy of this power ever since by not using it all the time. So let me go through some of those points. Judicial review is not what I would call regular judging, where a judge interprets the law, has two different parties who are conflicted under the law and say, I'm reading the law, I'm interpreting the law, you win, you lose. So for lack of a more elegant term, I'll call that regular judging. Judicial review is saying you win, you lose, not because I'm interpreting the law, but because I have the right to say if the law itself was constitutional. It's a higher level of adjudication. The Supreme Court is not granted that power explicitly in Article 3. However, there's a hint of it in Federal 78, which is the most famous paper that discusses the judiciary, written by Alexander Hamilton. What Federal 78 says is that any law by its nature that is contrary to the Constitution must be void. But who's going to be responsible for that? So the assumption then is structurally that the Constitution, I like it, thank you. And that's the nice version. I actually used that exact version from Avalon. Great. So it says a few paragraphs down that by definition, a law that is against the Constitution should be void. But who would be the party to do that? This is where things get very complicated. There is no mechanism for the Supreme Court or any federal court to get a bill or a law automatically. It must be litigated by an injured party. And this is how the federal courts not only develop the power of judicial review, but were able to expand it with different types of plaintiffs, arguing that in the case of the famous case Marbury versus Madison, that Congress got the Constitution wrong. They got that opportunity. Then soon after, they got to choose cases that challenged state constitutions, state courts, and state laws. So the United States Supreme Court built the power of judicial review very carefully, very sparingly. So it's important to note that after Marbury versus Madison in 1803, the next time that the United States Supreme Court declared a U.S. law unconstitutional was not until 1857 in the famous Dred Scott case, the infamous Dred Scott case. So that is a considerable resistant or hesitant or restrained court. Now, during that period before the Civil War, the court did train some of its powers on states. But it's important to remember that the core of judicial review is the legitimacy of the court to tell elected officials that they got the Constitution wrong. And if you really think about it, that has got to be done sparingly. It's not to say it's wrong when it's used, but when elections have consequences, those consequences can be overturned, but it would be very harmful for the court's position to use that all the time. So in the case of, we'll speed along to interbranch litigation, which is the subject of my newest book. It's a fascinating question that, as we mentioned earlier, Congress is often gridlocked. When Congress is gridlocked, often it cannot challenge presidential power. So members of Congress, this has happened dozens of times, not a lot, I mean a few dozen times over the past 50 years, have banded together to sue in federal court saying, and I want you to think about this, that they are representing the institution as an injured party. In other words, a presidential action constitutionally harmed Congress as an institution and therefore them as members of that institution. 10 of those cases were about war powers, where members of Congress alleged that a president was acting in an unconstitutional manner when that president was pursuing an unauthorized military action. This goes from Nixon's bombing of Cambodia, which was secret and unauthorized, all the way through President Obama's NATO-led campaign against the dictator of Libya, which was not authorized by Congress either. So if you're a court justice, what do you think you would do with these cases? Elected members of one chamber are coming to you to undermine the elected member of a different branch.
You would stay out of it.
Yes. So we often think that judges are activists. What does activist mean? It can be liberal or conservative. There's liberal activism, there's conservative activism, and there's nothing inherently wrong with activism. Activism says that I'm substituting my judgment as a judge for the elected voter, for the elected official's judgment. Deference means that you're going to say that the political process has its own legitimacy and we're going to let that play out. So even though there are a lot of accusations of judicial activism, this is one area in which there is no judicial activism whatsoever. The interest then is whether the judge wants to be in the middle of a fight between branches, and more importantly, do Congresses work for it? So then the judge would say, well, I don't know why you don't do the things that you want us to do for yourself. If you want to stop a war, pass a law that takes away the authorization. Pass a law that reduces funding. Don't come to me to do what you can do naturally. And with now I've gotten you on that side, but I'm now going to twist it around a little bit. Here's the problem with that judicial posture. When the court says no to Congress members who are suing, they often say this: come back when your case is more developed. I'm going to tell you what that means. The president is acting on an issue that you never authorized. What I'd like you to do now is pass a law to stop him from doing that. What do you think will happen? Let's say the members of Congress say, okay, we're going to come together and pass a law to tell the president not to do something. This could be an executive order, by the way, also speaking of that. It could be a war action. It could be any number of things. If the House and Senate pass that law, what do you think the president's going to do?
Veto.
Yes. So now the House and Senate have to pass by 2/3 an override of that veto. And the court says, after you do that, and the president is still doing the thing you told him not to do, now you have a case. So which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. But here's what the court just did. The court just reversed something. The court just said, you're trying to stop the president from doing something that you never authorized him to do. You have to have one vote and then a supermajority and another supermajority. When actually what that's doing is giving a stamp of legitimacy to the presidential action unless they disapprove. So again, this is a flip-flop. That's not executive. When the executive is carrying out something, it means that they have some instruction. But so many executive actions in the modern day, and I would clearly say this is true for Democrats and Republicans, it may be the one thing that they have most in common is using presidential power. And again, not in an arbitrary way, but in a very aggressive way. Presidents in the modern era say, I can do essentially what I want to do until I'm told no. That is a very different view than the founders and early presidents had. That is sometimes called the Whig philosophy of the presidency, which is, I'm going to wait for instructions. Congress legislates, then I carry out. I don't go first and ask them to disapprove of something. It's a complete reversal of what the word executive means. But this is where the Constitution, again, evolves in real time. So in my book, I don't say what's right or wrong, but I'm saying that there are consequences for both of these actions from the court side. So the more the court is restrained, the more the presidency operates with impunity. The court would say, maybe that's true, but it's really Congress at the end that needs to step up and be the first branch in theory as well as on paper.
And just a quick follow-up. You think this is why that a lot of candidates, as we've seen running for 2020, they really exaggerated this chief legislator role of saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get us free college, etc., etc. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, there are some times, though, when you need Congress. So the president cannot take money from the Treasury without an appropriation. So does that answer the question? There are things the president cannot do unilaterally, and one of those things is to spend money. Mm-hmm. Now, there are certain circumstances in which a president can shift money around, and so President Trump, remember the border wall controversy, Congress explicitly did not fund a border wall appropriation at the level. They did fund some of it, but they didn't fund it at the level that President Trump requested. So the president invoked an emergency act where he would have the ability to shift money around on a temporary basis. And this is it's a long story. But it brings back the question that you said earlier about the War Powers Act. So in 1973, Congress decides to, in theory, take back war power. But I do say in theory, because when Congress passes a reform, it has to actually do more than pass the reform. It has to use the act itself. Congress has rarely, honestly, there's only one instance in the past 45 years where Congress really did try to yank back foreign policy power. And it was again about Donald Trump and the support that he had for Saudi Arabia and arms sales related to the Yemen civil war. So it's very rare that Congress takes a stand and says to presidents outright that they're abusing power. And the War Powers Resolution is just one of many examples where it seems that they're bringing back power, but they're not, because they fail to use it on a regular basis. We can go on to that another time, but if that makes more sense. President Biden cannot make money out of thin air and apply it to the issue of his choice. An executive order cannot do that. It has to be appropriated. Now, you might argue, though, that because of the way that private and public loans are regulated by the federal government, that he could use some executive order power. I do not know anything about this, so I'll stop there. It's possible that there are some regulatory matters related to student loans that a president could order his cabinet secretaries to enforce in a new way.
All right, thank you for that very thorough response. Now we do have a guest question. This is from Stan Scott. He asks, the conventional story holds that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention believed Congress would check the presidency, that it would defend itself as an institution without regard to factional dynamics. What factors do you think have made Congress less likely to act as an institution rather than protecting the ideological views of the faction that controls it?
So it's a great question, and it's very complex. So let's think about so Stan is referring, I think, indirectly to a famous line in Federalist 51 that says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. And what that means is that checks and balances are opportunities for elected officials to look out for their institutions, not just for their own power, but institutional power. And the reason why that will work is that it's okay to be power seeking. And in fact, the Constitution hopes for that. So the only way to have vibrant checks and balances, which by the way, nobody would want all the time because then you just have gridlock. What the framers were trying to avoid is simple majority rule. And whether or not we agree with that, the obstacle course that is the separation of powers system requires a lot of agreement between the branches. And there are actually very few things that any one branch can do unilaterally without any check or balance. So like the presidential pardon as an example, it's one power that is not checked, not balanced. It's very hard to find a lot of examples of that any of the one branches can do without ultimately being checked if the other branches want to. So what was the flaw? Why do we assume that presidents look out for the presidency? Do you think that that's true? Presidents look out for the presidency? Definitely, especially in the modern era. Do judges look out for the court? Do they try to maintain legitimacy and even grow power? Yes. So even someone like Chief Justice Roberts, maybe he's a committed Republican at one point in his life, but now he's the Chief Justice. And he is actually much more interested in protecting the legitimacy of the court. And we've seen this in some of his very controversial decisions. He might be actually going against his own personal wishes to try to make the court look more bipartisan or nonpartisan. Here's the problem. Does Congress look out for Congress?
Not necessarily.
We do not see that. What we see are when partisans are in charge of one of the other chamber, they look out for their own party's interests. They will lay down the checks and balances weapons when their own president is in office. So for example, Democrats don't check Democratic presidents to the extent that they check Republican presidents. Whereas we can say for the other branches that it doesn't matter what party's in power, the dynamic is more or less the same. So what Stan is saying is Congress does not think institutionally. It thinks in a partisan way about who's in charge of the majority. Why is that? That's a very tough question. And one of the answers might be that Congress doesn't think like Congress because Congress is really two dissimilar siblings. The House and Senate don't think for each other. They think for themselves. And even that is obviously very complicated as we see right now. How could 535 different elected interests see the world as anything to combat one person in a pyramid who's in charge of one branch? So the framers may have counted on statesmen, as they were called at the time, who are ultimately very flawed figures, but who would be able to bring people together. So in the 1800s, Congress was predominant with only a few exceptions. That's why you can probably only name a handful of presidents from the 1800s, most people. Because the truth is most presidents were not consequential. Congress was in charge. The Speaker of the House and the party leaders of the Senate were often the legislative lions of their time because the average member did not have a career-seeking trajectory. So if most people in Congress don't want to be there, they're not very interested in serving for long, then you would delegate power to people who had that institutional memory. In addition, the United States as a national body did not govern as much as it does now either. So most power in those days was at the state or local level. So Congress was not in constant motion with large agenda items where presidential and congressional candidates said to you three, your life is going to be better because I am empowered at the national government. Other than slavery, taking new states into the Union, war and peace, international trade, building post offices and roads, there's not a lot of activity in the traditional sense of what the national government does today. The national government says today, your health, your wealth, your happiness is a national concern. Therefore, Congress as a body is ironically more responsible than ever and less effective than ever because every single person does not have the right incentive to cooperate for not the common good, but for the institutional good. Instead, what we see are short-term strategies for power. Those strategies are so short-term that they're actually the opposite of what you think Federalist 51 wants. Members of Congress often openly bash their own chamber, their own branch, and say, we are terrible at overseeing war. We're terrible at closing bases. We're terrible at seeing trade agreements. We're terrible at reducing the deficit. And in my earlier research, I studied these strange instances where members of Congress tied their own hands like Ulysses did to combat the sirens. They will say institutionally, we are terrible at our job and we're going to tie our own hands for the national interest. That is not something that you ever hear a president saying in the modern times. Sometimes you hear court justices say that when they're being confirmed, that they want to be humble, they want to wait. But when they're actually on the bench, they have a much more rigorous view, I think. Not always. So it's unfortunately too much of that was a long-winded answer, and we're running out of time. But we want to have members who think for themselves. We want to have members who care about the institution. But even when I've had a chance to talk to Congress people, including Chairman Yarmouth, who co-teaches a class with me, I've had a chance to challenge him on this and say, when I first met you, you were elected, George W. Bush was president, you had a button on your lapel that said Article 1. But I noticed when President Obama was in office, he didn't wear it anymore. I said, why not? He said, we're on the same team. That's not, and if he were standing here, I would say this, and he knows this. I would say, but that's not thinking institutionally. And that's something that we need to return to, but not for its own sake. It has to be because we believe that a collection of elected members from across the country that represents both parties and lots of different types of ideas has their own independent view of the national interest. You can't like the president only when he's of your party. The institution of the presidency is still not a perfect mirror of America. Congress isn't either, but perhaps it's a better and more accurate reflection if they seized that narrative.
Thank you once again for the very, very astounding and very refined answer, Dr. Farrier.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So we are almost out of time. Since we don't have any more questions from the audience, I would just like to conclude by encouraging you to check out our website. The link is posted in the chat. You can also see our social media and follow us on there as well. And once again, a huge thanks to Dr. Farrier for agreeing to do this. This is, of course, a brief taste of what her classes are going to be like. So if you enjoyed her her responses and want more of her brilliance, once again, highly recommend you to sign up for her classes next semester. Julia or Daniel, would you like to say anything else? No? All right. Once again, Dr. Farrier, thank you. Thank you.
You're
It's
welcome.
been a
It's
pleasure.
been a pleasure. It really is. Daniel, I expect to see you in the fall at 8 a.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays. And
All
again, anybody can find me, j.farrier@louisville.edu. I'm still on the political science website. Ford Hall is my home. It will always be. And I'm so appreciative of the great students and the amazing alums that we launch every day. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's it, folks. And hope to see you sometime in the future.
Thank you very much again, Daniel, Julia, and Caleb. I really appreciated the time. Bye.
Thank you,
All right.
Dr. Farrier.
Thank you.